Ok, ci siamo. Si schianta contro l'iceberg a dritta, giusto? E procede a sobbalzi provocando delle falle tipo codice Morse dit dit dit, lungo la fiancata sotto la linea di galleggiamento. Poi lo scomparto di prua comincia ad allagarsi. Ora, mentre il livello dell'acqua si alza, trabocca dalle paratie stagne che sfortunatamente non superano il ponte E.
Ma quindi le paratie stagne del Titanic vennero progettate male? E la risposta è no, anzi erano molto più forti di quanto previsto dai progettisti. Ciao ragazzi e bentornati su Titanic. Oggi torniamo a parlare del discorso paratie stagne, un argomento del quale abbiamo parlato già diverse volte e del quale già ne feci un video qualche mese fa. Avevamo già parlato del motivo per il quale vennero progettate in quella maniera, ma ho voluto chiamare nuovamente Mark Chirnside, uno dei migliori storici al mondo sul Titanic, appunto per andare ancora più a fondo alla questione. Mark è in assoluto il mio autore preferito, ha scritto decine di libri, uno più bello dell'altro e uno con ricerche più approfondite dell'altro. È una persona che scava a fondo negli archivi e tutto quello che dice nelle sue ricerche e nei suoi libri è appunto supportato da documentazione primaria. Sicuramente avrete visto Mark comparire in tantissimi documentari sul Titanic che sono stati mandati in onda nel corso degli anni e sicuramente se seguite il canale già da un po' di tempo lo avrete visto già come ospite qui su Titanic. Una persona che io stimo e ammiro tantissimo e che ho voluto avere nuovamente qui sul canale per parlare non solo del perché le paratie stagne del Titanic vennero concepite in quel modo, ma anche per parlare di tutti i cambiamenti che vennero apportati alla Olympic, la nave gemella del Titanic, dopo il naufragio per aumentarne la sicurezza. E ovviamente, come fa qualunque persona appassionata del Titanic, chiacchierando abbiamo parlato di tantissime altre cose diverse. Come ad esempio, se vi dicessi che i compartimenti danneggiati dall'iceberg non furono 5, non furono 6, ma furono probabilmente 7? Le scialuppe del Titanic vennero effettivamente riutilizzate sulla Olympic, oppure il Britannic, come viene spesso sentito dire, era più lungo delle sue navi gemelle? Tutto questo e molto altro lo scoprirete in questa seconda parte della mia intervista a Mark Chirnside. Ah, e come sempre non dimenticatevi di lasciare un like e iscrivervi al canale. Alright guys, we're back with Mark Chirnside. Of course you remember him because we already talked few weeks ago, or maybe a month or so ago. If you didn't see the first interview that we had, Mark is one of the best sources, historians, you name it, that you can find um, on Titanic, other ocean liners. He wrote so many books. He's one of my favorite, or maybe he's my favorite author. He's coming out with a new book, but we'll talk about that later. Uh, and we promised you a second part of the first interview because in the first part we talked about all these myths and legends about Titanic, how it was poorly built, Titanic as well as the Olympic. There were corners cut and substandard materials, you name it. Everything that makes the sensationalism about Titanic that everyone likes, but we've seen that that's not actually true, or actually it's not all true. So in this part, we wanted to talk about all the major changes that this ocean liners, these ships, went through after Titanic sank in, let's say, Olympic to put on a topic. Let's talk about Olympic, but that adds up to all the other major liners. And who better that to do that than Mark himself? So I wanted to start with thanking Mark for to be here with us first, and asking him probably the the question that I get mostly on social media, on emails, on my live streams. And the question is, why did they build this ships with such a bulkhead design? Meaning, why didn't they raise the bulkheads all the way up the superstructure? Let's say all the way up to B deck or A deck, you name it. Was it a flawed design? Was it a mistake by the designers? Or was it made because of a purpose?
Well, thanks for your really kind comments. I'm blushing. Blushing, I think. Thanks very much for having me. It's great to talk Titanic. Well, the watertight bulkhead design was configured according to the design specification. So the design specification for Olympic and Titanic was that the White Star Line wanted them to be able to float with any two watertight compartments flooded. That was the highest design standard that was recognised by the British Board of Trade, and that was the same standard that other large Atlantic liners were built to, such as Lusitania and Mauritania, the Holland America liner Rotterdam, which was completed in 1908, and the other major passenger ships of the period. So what Harland and Wolff did, and in particular Edward Wilding, was come up with a watertight bulkhead design which was actually far in excess of that standard. So they designed these ships that they were almost three compartment ships, so that they built in a larger margin of safety so that they could float with more than any two compartments flooded. And in several scenarios, they could float with 4 different sets of compartments flooded. So really, they had a very high flotation capacity. And it's often overlooked that the majority of the watertight bulkheads extended to D deck, and the remainder went up to E deck. And these ships were high freeboard ships. So in other words, the sides of the ships, the hull, it's actually very high above the waterline. So in absolute terms, in terms of feet or in terms of meters, whichever measurement you use, the bulkheads extended far above the waterline. And in any scenario that they calculated, even the lowest watertight bulkheads would remain above water by a much larger margin than what was required to float with 2 compartments flooded. So they were working to the highest design standards of the time, and really the design they came up with was not that different to what future liners were built to. So an example is Cunard's Queen Mary in 1936. She was built to be a 3-compartment ship. So it's pretty similar in terms of the design standard, and that was even after the disaster. So in answer to the question, was this a flawed design? My answer is no. They designed the ship to a certain standard. They exceeded that standard. The problem was that the amount of damage Titanic received was so bad that she could not remain afloat. Any design, any ship will sink if the damage is bad enough. And one of the important points, I think, that is often overlooked is that the damage was being discussed at the British inquiry. And Edward Wilding, who was Harland and Wolff's naval architect, testified. He described the watertight compartments in detail and the flooding. And if we take into account the damage to the first 5 compartments, so that's up to and including boiler room 6, they were all flooding uncontrollably. There was also damage to a 6th compartment, which is boiler room 5. Now, that was noticed immediately after the collision, but in that compartment, the pumps managed to keep ahead of the water for a while. But there was also a 7th compartment, boiler room 4, and at a later time in the sinking, water was noticed coming into boiler room 4. Now, it seems likely that that was minor damage to boiler room 4, which wasn't noticed earlier on in the sinking. In any case, that effectively means that up to 7 compartments had been damaged in some way by the collision with the iceberg. And Edward Wilding was asked a question, assuming damage to all of these compartments, how high would the bulkheads have to go to keep the ship afloat? And Edward Wilding said that it was impossible, that no possible extension of the existing bulkheads could have kept the ship afloat. So that helps put into context, I think, the extent of the damage that Titanic received, and that Titanic couldn't survive that damage. I don't think any other comparable ship could survive the damage either. Nonetheless, she remained afloat for 2 hours, 40 minutes after the collision, and right till the end, she remained relatively stable. So they were able to launch the vast majority of the lifeboats safely. So it was certainly a disaster, but also I think it was a testament to Titanic's design that she remained afloat as long as she did.
And one thing, this is such an amazing thing you said, because a lot of historians point out that Titanic sank so quickly, which it didn't compared to other sinking. If we want to point out the Britannic, who was sister ship, sank in 55 minutes. Lusitania, 16. Empress of Ireland, 14 minutes. Titanic was able to not capsize, remain stable for almost 3 hours. And that really is a testament on how good that ship was built. And the thing about the boiler room 4 damage, I've never talked about this anywhere, not in my live streams, not in my video, because it's something that really few people know. And correct me if I'm wrong, it might have something to do with the grounding theory of the iceberg.
Well, I think, I mean, you're right, this compartment is so often overlooked. Walter Lord mentioned it in his 1986 book, The Night Lives On, and he pointed out that boiler room 4 is often overlooked. I think in large part that's because the water was only evident later in the sinking. So with the damage they already knew about in the first 5 compartments flooding uncontrollably, they knew the ship was doomed anyway. I don't think boiler room 4's flooding is necessarily to do with the grounding theory. Whatever caused that inflow of water, I think it can be argued essentially it was minor damage, potentially to the side plating of the ship. It's really something, though, that is overlooked so often, and really we need to fully understand the details of that to understand the full extent of the damage that Titanic received. So it's one of those nice little things to speculate on. My colleague Sam Halpern has a website, which is titanicology.com. And he has a little research summary there which discusses Boiler Room 4. So it gives some details of the calculation, you know, the amount of tons of water that would have to come in. But it does seem to be flooding that was caused by some damage to the ship. You know, it wasn't happening because, you know, because that was coming in from other compartments at that point. So it is an interesting thing to debate about.
People, for people that don't know the grounding theory, basically there's this theory out there that says that Titanic might have grounded the base of the iceberg. So not just on the side, but on the bottom part. So let's say where the keel is. But it was actually built to resist a sort of grounding damage because of the double bottom. So it's a theory. We don't know, but it's out there. I think it's interesting and fascinating as other theories might have happened. We will never know for sure, but it's out there. But at least now people know that there's evidence that Boiler Room 4 was flooding as well. And I get a lot of, not say weird comments, but people that don't understand that probably Titanic was built better compartment-wise than most modern ships. Most modern ships are built with a 2 compartments ratio. So Titanic would have probably resisted an impact just like the Concordia, who was built with a 2 compartment ratio damage. So it was a very, very well built ships. But the reason that they didn't put the bulkheads all the way up, we were talking about this before and already made a video about it, because ocean liners are not warships. Warships need to go out there in battle and resist to all the hits possible. So the best way to do that is create more compartments as possible. But the crew of these ships are used to be cramped in little spaces, and they don't need a lot of space. They don't need comfort. And this is what an ocean liner needs. It needs comfort for passengers. The crew needs to be able to go around the ship and not have to go through, you know, ladders, climb up and down, and go through weird corridors and everything. So for compartments, it's twice as more as earlier ships. So it's a lot. The problem is that they didn't even think about a sort of damage just as the one that Titanic had, like a side swipe impact. But how did this design change? So we know that after Titanic, there were major updates to Olympic. A big one was the bulkheads. And some source even claims that these bulkheads were like strengthened because they were not strong enough. So this goes back to the first interview that we had when we talked about there were poorly designed ships, but this is not the case. So how the bulkheads design changed after the disaster?
Okay. Well, this was true, of course, not just of Olympic, but also of other ships. So, as an example, White Star's Adriatic, which was completed in 1907, was modified so that she could survive with 3 compartments flooded. Cunard's Aquitania was also being built at this time, and they had decided to improve the watertight subdivision. So essentially across the industry, there was a situation where shipping lines were wanting to upgrade their ships. And what the White Star Line did was upgrade the design criteria. So the original design specification for Holland and Wolff, as we've discussed, was that these ships would float with any 2 watertight compartments flooded. What the White Star Line did was go to Holland and Wolff and say that they wanted Olympic to be made as safe as possible, and that she would theoretically be able to survive the sort of damage that had sunk Titanic. So what they did was modify the watertight bulkheads. They raised a number of them, and they also lowered some of them towards the stern as well, which is not commonly understood or realized. And they did it so that Olympic was divided into groups of 6. So as an example, the first 6 compartments, from the forepeak, the 3 cargo holds, through to boiler room 6, boiler room 5, represented the first 6 compartments, and they raised strategically certain watertight bulkheads up to the underside of B deck. And the purpose of raising these bulkheads was that each bulkhead which was raised was essentially intended to carry a group of 6 watertight compartments. So as another example, if all 6 of the boiler rooms were flooded, of course the ship wouldn't have any boiler power, but she would have remained afloat. Now, the question about strengthening the watertight bulkheads, I think people are often misled, because there are a lot of inaccurate claims that we see made about the subject, and a lot of the time these claims are made without understanding the context. So the original watertight bulkheads were designed to be very strong. They were far in excess of the standards that were required by the Board of Trade. They were in excess of the standards from Lloyd's Register, which or actually the standards produced after the Titanic disaster. And there are lots of different examples of the structure of the bulkheads. For example, the stiffeners on the bulkheads, which I think were 75 to 100% greater than what was required. I'm going from memory there, but it was certainly a large proportion. And the bulkheads were that strong for their intended purpose. Now, if they were raising particular bulkheads as high as B deck, what that meant was that in the new configuration, those bulkheads would need to withstand an even greater head of water. So the original bulkheads were perfectly strong for their intended purpose, but by raising the watertight bulkheads, they needed to be strengthened again, because the stresses on the bulkheads would increase as well. So to maintain that margin of strength, part of increasing the height of the bulkheads was also strengthening them. And what they also did was replace and strengthen the watertight doors on the bulkheads which were extended. So the original watertight doors, the original watertight bulkheads were more than strong enough for their purpose, but the design purpose changed in 1913 by extending certain of those watertight bulkheads. They needed to make them stronger because they were extending them even higher. So that's the context behind that modification.
And correct me if I'm wrong, they were so strong that I think Harlan Wolf designers, when they were doing calculations, they didn't add this straps or this plates into
Oh,
consideration, so they pretended that they were not there. So the bulkhead will actually take all the stress by itself, and it did.
yes. So what Holland and Wolf did was they were very cautious. They were very conservative when they worked out the strength. So I think it was believed, for example, that the bulkheads could withstand a head of water of about 150 feet. Now, the the draft of water, so the depth of the hull underneath the water line, that's less than 35 feet. And you've then got the bulkheads extending above the water line, for a great distance on top of that. So the watertight bulkheads could withstand a head of water that was much higher than they would ever have to experience. And in doing those calculations, I forget exactly which components it was, but Harland and Wolff treated some of the strengthening features as if they were not there. So they ignored them in the calculation of strength. So there was an additional degree of strength in the design. Basically, they were just being very cautious in making sure that they had the strength that was necessary.
And this is what people don't put into consideration. The difference between a conservative uh, upgrade and a general upgrade. So that's what Harlan Wolf did. They put conservative things in place so they didn't have to work on them after in the ship career.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a lot of examples of, I think it was 1931. It was always like a heavy storm or something where during an inspection, they found like cracks in Olympics Hall or maybe in between the portholes, but they were found during these inspections, but they were not general. It was just maintenance. It's normal for a ship after a long service to wear out in certain areas, but it was nothing structural. It was nothing like the Leviathan or the Majestic that after 2 years of service, people heard this like cannon bangs and actually the whole cracked.
Yes. Yeah, well, I mean, 1931 is the only example of any really significant repairs needing to be done to Olympic. And what it was beneath each of the large portholes along sea deck was a very small drainage hole. It's quite hard to see, although I think it's visible on the Titanic big piece. If you look closely, because there's one of the portholes
I'll put
there.
up a picture that when I went to Vegas and I have a few pictures of the big piece and I'll probably show them from there.
Oh, great! Yeah, that would be really good. And essentially, what seems to have happened over time was that there was that very thin strip of metal between the porthole and the drainage holes, and over time, perhaps aggravated by corrosion that's happened, over the years, a little over half of the portholes had fractures below them to those drainage holes. And what the White Star Line did in nearly all those cases was undertake welding repairs. Harland and Wolff welded that material to restore it to how it had been. And in a very small number of cases, they did add some additional steel to provide some local strengthening. Um, But I think really, if you look at all of the express liners of the period, so you know, we're talking about Mauritania, we're talking about Aquitania, we're talking about Berengaria, Leviathan, Majestic. So ships that were built in the UK, that were British built, ships that were built in Germany. Every single one of them had some kind of similar repairs when they reached a certain age. And by way of comparison, there are quite a number of comments that Olympic was seen during her service career as an example of a strong ship. So I think because of the prominence of the Titanic and all of the interest in Titanic, there is that focus on Olympic, which I think is important. But again, it's equally important to understand the context of the other ships that were in service at the time. And I think that's something that's so often overlooked, because you know, people will take a detail and then not look at the broader context. And the broader context is really important, because you need that context to have that proper understanding.
And this is why I called you on my channel, because I think my subscribers already hate me for repeating this word all the time, contest. You need to understand the context of the story of Titanic to understand the story of Titanic. And before I start getting comments such as, he said welding, they were not using welding. Well, they did. After a period of time, with rivets, they started using welding and made their life simpler. So it wasn't that used in 1910, 1920, around 1930, they started using welding to repair the ships. But one major thing that I wanted to point out was lifeboats, because we all know, even by seeing the picture that you have behind you, that Olympic was filled with lifeboats after Titanic sinking. The law changed, so they had to they started looking for lifeboats everywhere they could. They even had strikes, like the crew on Olympic strike, because the lifeboat that they found weren't that new. They were leaking, so they striked and like, we're not gonna work on the ship if you don't give us brand new lifeboats. And I did a video last year, and it's on my book as well. And this is why it's so nice to talk with historians such as yourself and find out more research, because in my video and in my book, I stated that we have no idea what happened to Titanic lifeboats. For years, people thought that they might have been used on Olympic because they were brand new. Olympic was the twin sister, so people thought that after staying in the pier for a short period of time, they loaded it on the Olympic, and there's a picture of the Olympic and these boats floating. I think it was Southampton. But I read a beautiful article that you wrote that apparently that was not the case, because the dimension and the size of the lifeboats that they were used on Olympic, they were different than Titanic's.
Yes, well, there's two, I guess there's two issues here. So there's the immediate aftermath of the Titanic disaster, when they had to get some lifeboats onto Olympic as a temporary solution. And they added a number of collapsible boats at Southampton. and it was partly because of concerns about those boats that Olympics crew went on strike. In reality, it was only really one of the boats that had a problem. It had a slight leak. And the story of the strike, it gets a bit complicated because in the event, the White Star Line recruited additional crewmen, and those crewmen were not part of a trade union. So it then turned into a sort of labour dispute. And if people want the full story, there's a presentation of mine which will be going up on my website probably a bit later this month. So that was well timed. But anyway, when they added these boats to Olympic in April 1912, Titanic's lifeboats were still in New York. And of course, the boats they were adding to Olympic were all collapsible. So they were a different type of boat. Now, we know that Titanic's boats remained in New York until the end of 1912. I believe it's December 1912 that we have the last mention of them. And of course, Olympic returned to Holland and Wolff in October 1912 for that lengthy refit. So we've already talked about one of the changes being the watertight bulkheads, although there were other changes, but there's a lot to talk about and so little time. But yeah, in February 1913, Holland and Wolff produced a blueprint of Olympic's new lifeboat configuration. And this blueprint showed the original lifeboats which were fitted on Olympic, and then all of the new boats that were being fitted on Olympic. And they're all there in a nice neat table, and you could see the different rows. There were 6 of this lifeboat or 10 of this, whatever it was. And the additional lifeboats which were fitted to Olympic are all different in size and specification to Titanic's boats. So we know from that the new boats being added were not from Titanic, and there is also paperwork which explains that some of the boats were being delivered late. So these were boats that had been ordered, they were being built, and they were delivered late because of those delays in manufacturing the boats. So again, that is the evidence that these were new boats. They were not Titanic's boats being reused on Olympic. So I can understand people making an assumption. We don't know what happened to Titanic's boats, so perhaps it's logical to imagine that they were used on Olympic. But in reality, the evidence is very clear. The additional boats added to Olympic were different. They were different in size, different in specification, and they were newly manufactured boats. So what we can say is that we don't know what happened to Titanic's boats, but we know they were not used on Olympic. And incidentally, they were not used on Britannic either, because the lifeboats on Britannic were, again, different in specification. So, for example, the main Britannic lifeboats were larger and were longer in particular. So they were not used on Olympic and they were not used on Britannic. So,
and some of them on Britannic were motorized as well.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
And now that you mentioned Britannic, it just came to mind one question that I get asked, and it's why didn't they add the gantry davits, so the electrical davits that they were installed on Britannic on Olympic? Correct me if I'm wrong. I always, from what I read and where I researched, that they didn't put them on the Olympic because being electric, if there was a problem with the electricity or something, They would not be able to use them, while the welding davits were just manual, so it was easier to operate. So I don't know if there's any other reason of why didn't install the gantry davits on the Olympic.
Okay. Well, to be clear, I don't know of any documentation on the subject. So there is no documentation I know of that said we are thinking of Olympics lifeboat configuration and we've decided not to do this or not to do that, and these are the reasons. So we don't know specifically, it's not documented to my knowledge. Um, I think, first of all, Britannic was under construction when Titanic sank. So, point number one, it's much easier to incorporate a change of this sort into a ship that is under construction, a new ship that's not been built yet. So, I think that's a large part of it. Um, as you pointed out, for Britannic, these huge girder or gantry davits were electrically operated, and she had an additional battery system installed, which took up part of what was otherwise valuable space on A deck, and that was an additional power supply in an emergency, because she also had the main electric engines down in the electric engine room and the auxiliary dynamos on D deck as well. So she had that extra as well. If they had wanted to fit gantry davits on Olympic, they would have had to come up with some solution in terms of the power. I think also in terms of the gantry davits, there is an additional concentration of weight at those particular points, at those particular davit stations. So that would have been something they needed to look at on Olympic. The boat deck is superstructure, so it's not part of the structural hull of the ship. The boat deck is strong enough for its purpose, but it's relative to the hull, it is lightly constructed. So that was something they would need to be very careful about. And possibly as well, they might have considered the issue of top weight. So Britannic was slightly wider than Olympic and Titanic, and that decision to make Britannic wider had been taken by October 1911, so before the Titanic disaster and before Britannic's keel was laid. And the key reason they made Britannic wider was to make sure that she had those it was to do with what they call the ship's GM, or metacentric height. So this is to do with how the ship behaves in a seaway. So all ships will roll to some degree, and what the shipbuilder had to do was get the perfect compromise. So the most important thing is that if a ship rolls, she will then correct herself. Now, if the metacentric height is too high, she will roll and correct herself very quickly. So she'll basically snap back. Now, you don't want that in a passenger liner because it will be uncomfortable for the passengers. Equally, if the metacentric height is too low or the ship's too tender, then she will roll and she will take a longer time to correct herself, which is not right either. So it's a very difficult balancing act.
As far as I remember from my engineering studies, it takes 2 tons of weight on the bottom to deal with 1 ton of weight on top, for what I
Okay.
remember.
Okay. Yeah, it might be. I don't I couldn't answer offhand. But in any case, Britannic was made wider, and part of the reason for that was to make sure that her metacentric height was the same as Olympic's. So with Titanic, there were those additional first class accommodations on B deck in particular, and potentially, if Titanic had continued in service, she might have been a bit more tender than Olympic. So what they were trying to do with Britannic was make sure that she was in line with Olympic. So I think in that sense, potentially Britannic had a bit more margin in terms of adding top weight than Olympic did. So um, those are a couple of reasons. It's just speculation. We don't have any documentation which says for definite either way. But I think in large part, making those changes to an existing ship is a whole different story to doing it when you have a ship which is still under construction.
Last topic about Britannic is one thing I've learned from your books is that people think that Britannic was actually longer than Olympic and Titanic, which actually wasn't. It was just wider. It was the same
Yes.
size as Olympic and Titanic. You'll find a few sources out there, quite few sources out there, stating that Britannic was a few feet longer, but it was not. Read Mark's books because I found out the truth from his books.
Thank you, thank you. Well, it's an interesting example because it's one of those things where if you look at the primary sources, so this is the original documents, so Britannic's registration document with the British Registry, Holland and Wolff's records, which say how long she was. It's very clear she was exactly the same length as her sister ships, but what happened was by 1914, which is when Britannic was launched, there were a number of other ships being built or already in service, such as Cunard's Aquitania, the German Imperator, which later became Berengaria, Vaterland, which later became Leviathan, and then Bismarck, which later became Majestic. All of those ships were longer than Olympic. And what the White Star Line started doing for publicity reasons was to describe Britannic as about 900 feet long. So, 882 feet 9 inches. Yes, arguably that's about 900 feet, but they were very careful in the publicity department. They wanted to, I guess, try and hide the fact that Britannic was going to be shorter than these other ships. And really a bit silly, to be honest, because Britannic's gross tonnage was far greater than both Olympics and Aquitania's. So she was still by far the largest British ship built. And that was the case until Queen Mary was completed in the 1930s.
Yeah. And that's why we always say look at the primary sources. Never listen to news or newspaper articles or
Yeah,
whatever you
exactly.
name it.
Exactly.
Um,
Yeah. Because if you look at the primary sources, there's no debate. But if you go on to Google or AI or something, you can get an answer which says yes, Britannic was longer,
yeah.
but it's not true, and people will think, well, they are seeing conflicting information, so they will think there is confusion about it. Well, there is no confusion. Unfortunately, some sources are simply wrong.
Yeah. It's
Look at
just
the original documents, and we know the reality.
it's just like the fact that it was supposed to be called gigantic and then it was changed to Britannic, which it wasn't the case. It was always meant to be called Britannic.
Yeah, certainly the name Britannic is the only one
Mhm.
in Holland and Wolff's records.
Yeah. And let's touch the last topic that I didn't even think about talking about. It came out before we started recording, so people know. I've been trying for years to find out the proper use of the winches on the boat deck of Titanic. I've built several models and I've seen these winches in weird positions, and they were used to help the crew loading back up the lifeboats on deck. But I never found anything to help me understand the proper use or specifications or details or everything. So I was like, I'm going to ask Mark. And he confirmed that we don't have a lot of specs about this electric winches. But something came out and we started talking about the collapsible boats of Titanic. And he said, I don't have specifications about the winches, but I have specifications about how they used to lower the collapsible boats off of the officers' quarters roof. We know that caused a lot of issues during Titanic sinking because collapsible A pretty much floated off and collapsible B ended up upside down because they were not able to handle these boats to lower them because there was a weird system that needed to be attached on the funnel ropes. I don't know the term in English. So Mark has the specifications of how they actually these boats were supposed to be lowered.
Yeah, well, this is how they were intended to be lowered, and of course, this was different to what happened on Titanic. Um, so, for context, the four collapsible boats on Olympic and Titanic were a late addition to the design. So, Olympics were ordered in May 1911, and they were placed aboard Olympic certainly by the start of June 1911. And on Olympic, her collapsible boats were initially stored on the boat deck. By the time Titanic was being outfitted, as we've said, collapsibles B and A were placed on the roof of the officers' quarters, and I'm sure they felt they would never need them, but of course, as fate would have it, they needed them on Titanic's first voyage. But there is a description here from Francis Carruthers, who was the Board of Trade surveyor at Belfast, and he described how the apparatus worked. He said, the arrangement for getting the Engelhart boats from the top of the deck house adjoining the funnel casing was that there were rings for attaching the blocks and tackles, which were spliced into the funnel guys, so that's the guy wires we mentioned, at each side of the funnel above the boats. The tackles were not permanently attached, but were brought from the bosun's store when they were wanted. The intention was to lower the boats to the boat deck and then move them over to the nearest set of davits. Each of these boats was of wood and weighed about 3,300 hundredweight. They were placed about 8 feet 3 inches above the boat deck, and if not lifted down or slid down, as they might have been by using the ridge bars taken from the boats under the davits, these would have been about 30 feet long, would inevitably be damaged by pushing off and allowing them to drop to the boat deck. So we know, as was actually what happened, that if they simply came off the roof onto the boat deck, then the collapsibles would be damaged. And the other detail that is interesting is that the tackles needed to be brought from the bosun's store when they were required. So my understanding, of course, is that by the time the crew were looking at collapsible B and collapsible A, Titanic had sunk so far that the forecastle and the bow was already underwater. So they didn't have any option of retrieving those because they were already under the sea. So it's a very complicated system, and really just impractical. Maybe if they'd had the kind of the forward planning to get those from the bosun's store, then they would have been able to get the collapsibles off the officers' quarters roof and onto the boat deck. But in Titanic's case, that wasn't possible. And Carruthers did say that these collapsible boats would be of use even if they were in a damaged condition, which of course turned out to be very true. Collapsible B, I hope I've got this the right way around. Collapsible B, I think, was upside down, and collapsible A was floating, even though there was damage to it and they couldn't get the sides fully up. So it was better than nothing, but it did represent a logistical problem.
Yeah, as you said, they never thought they needed, so just added them on the ship, and that was it. They never thought to
Yes.
use it. And I've seen pictures of the Olympic, I think around 1918, 1920, with the tackles always attached to the wire. So I think it was they left it there in case they need it. So they didn't have to like do this, like go get them, attach them, and use them. So I think after the sinking of Titanic, it became like a permanent uh way to lower the boats. I don't know. I've seen pictures with these tackles attached. Maybe I can put them on screen if I find them. I mean, I think we covered everything that we have to cover for today. As you said, we could talk for hours to talk
Hours, years,
about
yeah.
this, but we'll probably have you on for another episode. I think we can make more episodes. I'll be happy to do that.
Yeah, be happy to. Thank you.
But one thing I wanted to point out, there's a new book of yours coming out next
Yes.
April. So I can't wait to get my hands on it. Just
That's one copy I've sold, so that's good.
That's good. And I hope you sell hundreds of thousands because you deserve it. Uh, could you like give us a little spoiler of what's it about? Mm,
Okay, yes. Well, the new book is called Olympic and Titanic: Triumph and Disaster. And Triumph and Disaster is actually a nod to a poem by Rudyard Kipling, which I believe it was written earlier, but I think it was printed in 1910. So it's fairly topical. It's in line with the times. And of course, it's Olympic that represents the triumph, and Titanic that represents the disaster. So if people have seen the double volume set of Titanic, the Ship Magnificent books, that is the sort of format that we're working to. So it will be a hardback book, the same sort of size. It is, I think, 368 pages, and including a color section. So it's a very big book, 200,000 words. There will be, I think, about 160 black and white images, and an additional 20 or so in color. And this book really goes back to the beginnings of the White Star Line. It traces their relationship with Hand and Wolf. It looks at Cunard. It looks at other competitors, particularly the German shipping lines. And it really goes into detail about the early design and planning of Olympic and Titanic. So it takes us right through the design process, right through what Hand and Wolf were doing, how the design was being developed, the improvements in the passenger accommodation. It takes us through how the ships were financed, all of the politics involved with New York and Southampton, so having to get the port facilities improved. And it really goes into the detail of Olympic's maiden voyage and her first season in 1911. And then it takes us through to 1912 and both the Titanic disaster and the months afterwards, where Olympic remains in service, but of course we have examples such as the mutiny on board in April 1912. So it's covering a relatively short period chronologically, but it really covers the detail, and whatever critics think of it, there is certainly a lot of material in there that has not been published before. So even people who've been interested in this subject for a very long time are going to find new, previously unpublished information. So if people are interested, I'll be posting updates on my website, on my blog, and we'll keep you posted, and particularly as the publication date gets closer.
While you were speaking, I pulled out the A Ship Magnificent just to point out to people that don't know how big these volumes are.
Huge,
Like,
yes.
they're huge, and they're two. This is people that follow me, they know. I call it the Titanic Bible. Because
Yes,
if
yes.
you want to know how the light switch were made, you just like pull out the these volumes, and they really are the the ABC to have in a collector's library or book collection, whatever. They're
Yeah,
amazing.
incredible, and
Yeah,
really are, and heavy as well. That they've got a
it's heavy.
reinforced spine, I think. It's because you have to be careful not to damage the books when you're
Yeah,
reading them.
they're really heavy. I'm
Yeah.
sorry for the Italian audience to tell that, as always, these books are not available in Italian. But as I always say, now you can use ChatGPT. You can like Snapchat. You can take a picture of the book, and the phone translates it for yourself. So everything is getting more accessible, everything is getting more easy, even if these books are not available in English. In any case, I'm here to help you out, to make videos out of them and everything. And I have guests such as Mark to come on the channel and gives us all this amazing informations that are really hard to find. So I can't wait to get my hands on your book.
Thank
I
you.
I want one with your autograph in it.
Yeah,
So
I'd be
we'll
happy to.
keep in touch for that. And I'm pretty sure we're gonna see each other again on the channel and talk about maybe Titanic, Olympic, and maybe other ships, because I'm pretty sure people are never gonna get tired to hear talking about this topic. So really, really thank you for being so kind and always being here with us. And
Thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me. It's great to talk Titanic, and yeah, I'd be happy to come back at some point in the future. We just need to get our diaries fixed up, and yeah, we'll do it.
all right, then, well, I'm sure we'll see you again pretty soon. Thank you, Mark. Thank you very, very much. E questa, ragazzi, era la seconda parte della mia intervista a Mark Chirnside. Come sempre una chiacchierata bellissima che lascia sempre una marea di informazioni. Informazioni che solamente uno storico del suo calibro riesce a fornire. La storia del Titanic prende tutto un altro aspetto quando le informazioni che abbiamo vengono messe nel contesto esatto. E questo deve aiutarvi non solo a capire l'importanza del fare ricerca, ma anche l'importanza del capire da dove proviene un determinato tipo di informazione. E spero che contestualizzare il tutto insieme a Mark Chirnside vi abbia reso il contesto della storia del Titanic un po' più chiaro. Sicuramente torneremo a parlare con Mark perché gli argomenti da trattare sono veramente tantissimi. Io intanto nel frattempo vi aspetto al prossimo video, sempre qui su Curiositanic.